Our newscast tonight, first in middle school textbooks and now through its annual diplomatic guide. Japan intensifies its claim to Korea-controlled Dokdo Island, drawing strong criticism from Seoul. And to resolve the deadlock over North Korea's unilateral demand for a wage hike, an emergency meeting is held by South Korean businessmen and the operating committee of the joint Kaesong complex. Samsung Electronics is on the rebound from its 2014 third quarter earnings shock as profits slowly pick up for the tech giant. Stay with us with these stories and more. It's 10 p.m. on a Tuesday here in Korea. I'm Daniel Choy in Seoul for Primetime News.
And I'm Hwang Ji-hye. Welcome to our newscast. Japan makes fresh territorial claims over Dokdo Island in an annual foreign policy report.
And this comes just a day after approving middle school textbooks which distorted historic facts.
And a move that will undoubtedly draw fury from the Korean government. Hwang Sung-hee starts us off.
Seoul slammed Tokyo on Tuesday for repeating its claims over Korea's Dokdo Island, this time in its annual diplomatic guide. This comes a day after Japan approved a batch of new middle school textbooks with stronger claims over the group of islets.
Despite the Japanese government's repeated nonsensical claims, Dokdo, Korea's sovereign territory, was the first to be sacrificed during the invasion of the Korean peninsula by Imperial Japan.
The so-called diplomatic blue paper, presented by Japanese Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida at a cabinet meeting on Tuesday, states Dokdo is clearly Japan's sovereign territory in terms of history and international law. The diplomatic paper will be published in English for the first time in 9 years, raising concerns Tokyo is trying to take the issue to the international stage. Experts say that the combination of the paper and the revised textbooks could pose a serious problem in terms of history education around the globe.
Textbooks play the role of passing down officially verified knowledge from the current generation to the future generation. But there are concerns that the social discourse surrounding Dokdo is being maintained and intensified for future generations.
Tokyo's unjustified claims over Dokdo, known as Takeshima in Japan, have been one of the thorniest issues between the two neighbors. As Japan steps up its territorial claims, experts say Korea must strengthen measures to oversee all events involving Dokdo. They also point out the need to set long-term policy goals to defend Korea's sovereignty over the group of islets. Hwang Sang-hee, Arirang News.
And on Korea's political front, the National Assembly kicked off its month-long extraordinary session today. It aims to resolve a variety of pending issues, including the much-debated pension plan reforms for public servants. Park Ji-won tells more.
Lawmakers are facing a full slate of issues during this session, from reforming debt-ridden pension plans for public servants and redistricting election constituencies to passing piled-up bills, for example, a bill that would make surveillance cameras at childcare services mandatory. Out of these issues, follow-up measures for last April's ferry disaster that killed over 300 passengers, mostly students, will be one of the top agenda items, especially with the accident's one-year anniversary approaching next week. Upcoming by-elections, which will be held on the 29th of this month, will also fall during this session, increasing pressure on the main rival parties. Only 4 seats are up for grabs, but both parties consider the election significant as they reflect voter sentiment ahead of next year's general elections. Leaders from the main rival parties will deliver speeches to the assembly this week, and interpellation sessions will take place over 4 days next week. This month-long assembly will continue until early next month. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Prime Minister Wankoo says the government will positively review raising the Seoul ferry that sunk nearly a year ago. Meeting with reporters today, he said the opinions of the victims' families and the public will be taken into account when deciding on the ship's recovery. In a latest poll, more than two-thirds of respondents said the ferry should be retrieved to help investigate the cause of the disaster that killed more than 300 people. The Prime Minister also said he hopes to meet with the families this week.
In a standoff over wage at the inter-Korean Kaesong industrial complex, North Korea gave a positive response today as South Korean businessmen asked for early settlement of the wage dispute. Our Kim Hyun-bin reports.
Several South Korean executives from the Kaesong Industrial District Management Committee went into the complex in North Korea on Tuesday. They held an emergency meeting to discuss wages with officials from the North Central Special Development Guidance Bureau, which is in charge of running the zone.
We explained to the North that realistically, the companies are stuck in a harsh situation. Since inter-Korean tensions are high, the wage hike, which is not a big deal, is amplified. We strongly requested that North Korean officials talk to the management to promptly resolve the issue. They agreed to tell their higher-ups.
The meeting comes as payday for North Korean workers approaches on April 10th. Pyongyang unilaterally demanded a pay raise of around 5% to $74 a month for its workers in Kaesong, effective that date. The committee says it has a little bit of a grace period.
Depending on the situation of the company, they have a grace period until the 20th of this month to pay their workers, so we do have some time left.
Even with the grace period, if a compromise is not made by the 20th of April, South Korean companies may have to plan for the worst-case scenario of the complex closing down. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News, Paju.
A former U.S. nuclear negotiator says the recently inked Iranian nuclear framework deal can serve as a good example for North Korea to come back to stall the multilateral talks on its denuclearization. However, doubts clearly remain as Pyongyang is yet to show any willingness to change its attitude. Our Son Jung-in has more.
Speaking at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies on Monday, Christopher Hill said recent progress on the Iranian nuclear deal could act as an inducer to persuade North Korea to return to the long-stalled six-party talks on its nuclear program. However, Hill, who was head of the U.S. delegation to the six-party talks in the mid-2000s, said that in order for it to happen, Pyongyang must first change its attitude and show sincerity towards denuclearization. Hill was quick to add that the Kim Jong-un regime has yet to make such a move. The former diplomat, who also served as U.S. ambassador to South Korea, said the North wants the world to recognize it as a nuclear power, but such a shift should never be allowed to happen. He underscored that Pyongyang must return to the negotiating table based on the conditions outlined in an agreement signed with the other party members in 2005. Hill also contended Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's recent remarks in which he said that under the New Deal, Iran would eventually end up developing a nuclear bomb, repeating the same path as North Korea. Hill also commented on the ongoing debate over the potential deployment to South Korean soil of a controversial U.S. missile defense system. He said it's an appropriate time for Washington and Seoul to be talking about the issue since the system, called Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD for short, would protect South Korea against the North's nuclear threats. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter says the goal of his trip to South Korea this week is to reinforce deterrence against North Korea. Speaking in the U.S. on Monday, local time, right before his scheduled visit to South Korea and Japan, Carter said he will be looking to improve capabilities to counteract an increasingly dangerous and provocative North Korea. He added Washington is looking to build an information-sharing arrangement with South Korea and Japan to collectively respond to crises in the region. Carter will meet with South Korean Defense Minister Han Min-gu on Friday. This will be his first trip to Seoul since becoming Defense Secretary in February.
The revised tax law in Korea that's upset many salaried workers who say they ended up paying more than they expected actually turned out to lessen the burden for the majority of low-income earners. Still, some of them had to pay extra, but the government has pledged to issue rebates. Our Shin Se-min has the details.
Korea's finance ministry says that the revised tax law has eased the tax burden on low-income earning taxpayers.
Based on last year's tax returns, on average, the tax burden on low-income earners or those making less than $50,000 per year did not increase. 85% of those taxpayers either felt a decrease in their tax burdens or no change at all.
But the ministry has admitted that the remaining 15% of low-income earners faced a heavier tax burden following the revision, worth precisely $73. To remedy this, the government has introduced a measure to issue rebates to these low-income earners, along with other changes like expanding deductions for households with more than 3 children. It still needs to gain parliamentary approval later this month, but once it does, it will affect some 5.4 million people.
The ministry still has to work on further improving the measure to collect more from high-income earners that make more than $130,000 and come up with institutional measures to raise taxes for high-income earners.
Hwang added as the government aims to still make the policy more fair, changes needs to be done. He added that the better transparency is critical in regaining the public's trust. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Samsung Electronics has posted profits that beat market expectations after a dip in earnings for 6 consecutive quarters. Slumping smartphone sales even led the Korean tech giant to freeze salaries this year. But according to our Song Ji-sun, the latest earnings report seems to shine a light at the end of the tunnel.
Samsung Electronics' first quarter figures show the Korean tech giant did better in terms of quality than it did in quantity. Samsung generally fared better than expectations despite seasonal factors and slowing demand in the global market. Samsung's sales for the first 3 months of the year stood at $43 billion, down 11% from last year. Profits were also down 30% during the same period, standing at $5.4 billion. While sales fell slightly short of market expectations, profits actually outstripped the market consensus, continuing its recovery, gaining 12% from the fourth quarter of last year. The smartphone maker's profitability also bounced back to double figures, settling at over 12.5%. While the guidance figure released on Tuesday does not break down performance by sector, market analysts assume Samsung generated $3 billion in profits from its semiconductor arm and $2 billion from its mobile sector.
Actually, Q1 results was quite impressive because the market consensus was 5.4 trillion won, but their OP results was 5.9 trillion won. Because of the Samsung Semi division, even though the it's a slow seasonality in Q1, they could reduce the cost, so they could make the high OP in Q1 this year.
With some analysts calling Samsung's first quarter figures an earnings surprise, there are expectations that the second quarter profits could top $7 billion, with its latest Galaxy S6 smartphone model set to go on global release on Friday. Song Ji-sun, Arirang News.
And Korean car makers have seen a dramatic drop in automobile exports in the first quarter of this year, but the opposite can be said about recent domestic sales. According to data released by Korea's Trade Ministry on Tuesday, the total number of cars sent overseas stood at roughly 735,000, down 6.6% year-on-year. The ministry says the weak yen and slow growth in emerging markets contributed to this sluggish performance. However, domestic sales of Korean and imported cars jumped by 8.8% in March alone to over 150,000 units. With an increase of 41%, imported cars sold especially well.
Now, the cherry blossoms are out, which means spring has officially sprung, and Korean students have an extra reason to celebrate the season. Local schools are taking a break during the first 2 weeks of May, participating in a government initiative to promote the tourism industry. Nearly 1,200 schools have agreed to participate, and that's about 90% of the total number of schools in Korea. The Tourism Ministry says that more than 3,000 tourism-related businesses across the country are offering discounts and special programs during the period. There's more specific information at spring.visitkorea.or.kr. The tourism break is expected to give a big boost to the country's travel sector, which has struggled since the Seoul ferry disaster last April.
Meanwhile, the Korean government laid out plans to promote the country's health and medical sector. This comes just in time to celebrate the World Health Day, April 7th. Our Kim Ji-hye reports.
Under the two-year plan unveiled Tuesday, the Ministry of Health and Welfare says it will strengthen cooperation with foreign governments for overseas expansion of more than 160 local medical institutions. The ministry has also set a 2017 goal of attracting more than 500,000 foreign patients to Korea each year, more than doubling the number of patients it targeted in 2013. The ministry also says it will promote research and development to facilitate the commercialization of its medical technology and devices. Other areas of focus include overseas patent application in the stem cell and regenerative sector and boosting medical and beauty product exports to nearly $29 billion in sales within 2 years. There will be specific efforts to create an anti-aging industry business cluster in Korea in hopes of raising market volume to nearly $18.5 billion, up from $13 billion in 2013. The ministry says it plans to establish an open-source platform to incorporate big data in the health and medical sector. To do this, it's establishing solid legal ground and a management system to ensure the safe handling of personal information. Finally, the ministry plans to raise country competitiveness in clinical testing to rank among the world's top 7, up 3 notches from 2013. Kim Ji-hye, Arirang News.
It's time for headlines from around the world.
Our focus today, the call for peace in Yarmouk, the ongoing fight in Yemen, and why Rolling Stones magazine is under fire.
And for details, we turn to Paul Lee at the News Center. Paul, the Palestinian leadership has appealed to the international community for help. How has the UN responded?
Well, members of the Security Council have jointly condemned the growing violence in Yarmouk, describing the situation as deeply concerning. The council also called for urgent humanitarian action to protect the safety of the refugees there, many of whom have been the victim of what it described as grave crimes committed by IS and the al-Nusra Front. Speaking at the UN headquarters in New York on Monday, the chair of the Security Council, Dina Kawar, stressed that such crimes did not go unpunished.
The members condemned in the strongest terms the grave crimes committed by Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra against 18,000 civilians in the camp and emphasized the need that such crimes do not go unpunished. The members called for the protection of civilians in the camp, for ensuring humanitarian access to the area, including by providing life-saving assistance, and ensure safe passage and evacuation of the civilians.
Yarmouk was once home to 500,000 Palestinians before the Syrian conflict began in 2011. According to UN agencies, some 18,000 civilians remain trapped in the war-torn camp, which has been devastated by fighting in the streets, airstrikes, and shelling. And turning to the crisis in Yemen, fighting has intensifies as Houthi rebels launched their biggest offensive to seize the country's second-largest city of Aden. In response to the conflict, China declared its support Tuesday for an immediate ceasefire by military forces. Beijing's foreign ministry said a truce was necessary to allow access for medical supplies and to prevent further collateral damage.
We're paying close attention to the severity of the humanitarian situation in Yemen and call on all sides to respect relevant international law and provide safety guarantee and convenience for other countries to evacuate their nationals. The UN Security Council should play a constructive role in easing tension and the humanitarian situation in Yemen and pushing forward a political solution.
According to the World Health Organization, more than 540 people have been killed and 1,700 others injured over the past few weeks. Meanwhile, the Red Cross says the southern port city of Aden has been completely cut off via land and sea, describing the humanitarian situation as catastrophic. And finally, switching gears to the latest headlines in the United States, the reputation of Rolling Stone magazine is under heavy fire over its discredited story of sexual assault at the University of Virginia. An outside review by Columbia University found that the magazine failed to check facts and follow basic journalistic standards. Dean Steve Cole, who led the review, said it was a result of collective fault of its reporters and editors.
It is a big statement of accountability, and it belongs with Rolling Stone. Look, we're not the DA's office here. We're not a special prosecutor. We did not find, and as we say in the report, we didn't find evidence of the kind of dishonesty, invention of facts, lying to colleagues, plagiarism, that in our experience and probably yours, you would regard.
Last November, Rolling Stone published a report detailing the alleged gang rape of a female freshman at a fraternity. The magazine has since apologized and retracted the article, citing what it called discrepancies. And that wraps up our look at international stories for now. I'll see you back here tomorrow night.
Hello and welcome. I'm Lee-Ji-yeon with your weather updates. The weather has been tricky these days. Chilly, cloudy and rainy days continue across the nation, and even light snow has piled up on the mountainous regions in Gangwon-do province today. And it seems like sprinkles will fall on and off on the southern coastal regions again overnight. But Wednesday should be a bit milder and sunnier in the afternoon compared to Tuesday, but temperature readings will persist to remain below averages with chilly winds, so dress accordingly. And on that note, here is the readings for tomorrow. The capital will kick off with a low of 4 and will jump up to 14, and Gwangju and Busan will expect the high of 17 and 13 respectively. And as for the other regions, Jeju Island and Daejeon will top out at 13 and 15, while Dokdo rises to 7. Now, chilly and breezy spring conditions will break on Thursday afternoon, with highs finally returning to seasonal averages. But it will be mild and sunny again, just in time for the weekend. Well, that's Korea for you, and here are the weather conditions around the globe for viewers outside of Korea.
And that wraps up our newscast. Thank you for staying with us. This has been Hwang Ji-hye.
And I'm Daniel Choy. Do join us for more, same time tomorrow. Goodbye for now.